Necromancy was a part of human history for centuries before it became the magic school for goth wizards. The power to control hordes of perfectly loyal, undying servants is an attractive one. But what even is a necromancer? Where did necromancy originate? How did modern fantasy necromancers get their image? And where do liches fit into this equation? Strap in. Today, I'm going to answer all of these questions and uncover the mysteries surrounding the origins of the modern necromancer. So what is necromancy? Well, Google defines necromancy as the supposed practice of communicating with the dead, especially in order to predict the future, sorcery or black magic in general. This is a bit too broad, in my opinion. By ultimately boiling it down to sorcery or black magic in general, it fails to account for the pre-Christendom history of the art. Historically, necromancy was not considered strictly evil. For some context, let's take a look at the word necromancy. The first root word, necro, is derived from the Greek word nekros, meaning dead person or corpse. Mancy, similarly, is derived from the Greek word manteia, which means divination by means of. A more historically accurate definition of necromancy is found in Martin Coleman's Communing with Spirits, which describes necromancy as the pretended art of divination through communication with the dead. Nowadays, when we envision a necromancer, we think of the classic fantasy villain, clad in black robes, using their vile arts and dark magics in an attempt to slay the hero. Their preferred method of combat? Sending armies of the undead to engage in glorious battle on their behalf. But this was not always the case. So let us begin with the real-world origins of necromancy. Veneration of the dead is an ancient concept that still persists in many cultures today. Mexico, China, India, and even America observe holidays whose purpose it is to remember and celebrate the dead. The idea of actually contacting a dead person and speaking to them in a more literal sense has generally fallen into the realm of superstition, but it wasn't always like this. You see, necromancy has its roots in ancient shamanism. Put simply, shamanism is the practice of communing with spirits. Typically, it's more associated with the spirits of nature. You may have heard of traditional Native American or Japanese beliefs centered around the idea that there are spirits all around us. Such ideas are ancient, predating most modern religions. Those whose purpose it is to commune with these spirits could accurately be called shamans. The most ancient form of necromancy, then, is when these ancient peoples attempted to contact the spirits of the deceased. Perhaps they sought guidance or protection, perhaps they simply wanted to see loved ones again. Nonetheless, they are necromancers all the same. This quote from Jack McKay's The Vile Art of Necromancy summarizes modern understanding of these ancient beliefs quite well. There were so many different tribal groups and indigenous peoples before recorded histories that this is simply an amalgamation of information summarized through many different cultures, beliefs, and understandings of the world around us. Some early humans believed that spiritual energy existed in all living things around us, and as such, communing with the dead was the same as simply speaking to the trees you see before you. Moving forward in history to a time that we actually have some record of, we find Homer's Odyssey, which would be the very first time we have record of how necromancy was represented. In the story, Odysseus travels to the underworld in order to raise the spirits of the dead using spells that a sorceress taught him. The spell involves following a specific recipe that includes the blood of sacrificial animals as well as a series of rites performed by a fire at night. So it's clear that from ancient times, necromancy has been associated with blood, sacrifices, and other occult behaviors. However, simply because it might be unsettling or strange, does not mean that it was not well established or respected. In fact, according to Daniel Ogden, Homer himself simply recreated the rites of evocation, quote, performed in banal historical visits to tombs to pay the dead their due. That is to say, these rites were not some aberration or seen as black magic. They were routinely performed for a variety of reasons, and it is around this time, approximately 700 BC, that necromancy is formally acknowledged. As stated before, this is where we get the definition found in Communing with Spirits. As time moved on, however, culture shifted. Rome would come and adopt much of ancient Greek culture, including many spiritual practices and essentially reskinning most of the Greek pantheon. This would include, for a time, the practice of necromancy as a means of divination. However, things would change. Jewish practices and beliefs, which condemned practitioners of necromancy as bone conjurers, would become increasingly more common amongst the people. This belief would slowly gain traction over the centuries until eventually all magic, not just necromancy, would be considered taboo in much of Europe. The explosion of Christianity would spell a difficult future for any would-be necromancers that didn't either leave or hide their practice from those who would condemn them. Christianity has long been against the practice of magic. This should be obvious to anybody who lived in the United States during the Satanic Panic around Dungeons & Dragons, or the similar, more recent panic that occurred around Harry Potter. Necromancy, while never specifically named, is forbidden in Scripture multiple times. Of particular note are the following two passages from the Bible. Leviticus 19:26 states, "Do not eat any meat with blood still in it. Do not practice divination or seek omens." Deuteronomy 18:10 states, "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft." Both of these examples expressly forbid divination, the primary use of necromancy as a practice. The reasoning provided by gotquestions.org is as follows. The idea that dead people's spirits can be contacted for information is false. Those who attempt such contact inevitably contact demonic spirits, not the spirits of dead loved ones. Those who die immediately go to heaven or hell, heaven if they believed in Jesus as Savior, and hell if they did not. There is no contact between the dead and the living. Therefore, seeking the dead is unnecessary and very dangerous. According to Christian beliefs, those who claim to have contacted the dead are actually being deceived by demons masquerading as humans. Consequently, such practices, broadly labeled as sorcery or witchcraft, would be outlawed in any area that Christian churches held power. Even in locations where Christianity didn't hold explicit political power, the social consequence of being found out as any kind of sorcerer would surely be dire. The association of necromancy with explicitly evil beings such as demons would cement a particular image in the public consciousness of those who practiced it. Necromancy in antiquity was already seen as gruesome, and the association with death is a pretty dark image to have. However, where necromancers in antiquity would be considered fairly neutral, or even potentially beneficial, now they would be condemned as outright evil. This is a perception that persists even today. Necromancer is a term used almost exclusively for evil characters in fiction. With necromancy firmly cemented as an evil practice in the public eye, the specifics of it would fade from public consciousness for upwards of half a millennia or potentially even longer. Determining exactly when is difficult, but Christianity's general distrust of anybody practicing sorcery would blur the lines between different kinds of practiced magic. Necromancy would fall in with myriad other magical practices and simply become another of many dark arts. For years, necromancers, if they were mentioned at all, would resemble those found in historical contexts. They would use their magic primarily to gain information or to divine the future. Whether they would call the spirits of the deceased or raise the body to physically speak, their purpose was the same: to attempt to divine information that would be otherwise inaccessible. In fact, it wouldn't be until September of 1932 that we would see the first account of the modern necromancer in Clark Ashton Smith's short story titled The Empire of Necromancers. The two-chapter story would be published in the pulp magazine Weird Tales and would be the first step in changing the perception of necromancers in sword and sorcery media forever. The story follows two necromancers, Matmuord and Sodosma, as they take over a desert nation populated primarily by corpses, which they raise into unlife. These corpses are bound by dark magics that, quote, compel the dead to arise from tranquil nothingness and obey henceforward in all things the dark will of the necromancer. The pair of dark wizards continue along and raise up many corpses. Eventually, when they'd raised enough, they planned to begin a war with the neighboring kingdom. Had it not been for prophecy, they may have even succeeded. I will provide a link to the version of the story that I read down below. I highly recommend it for anybody who thinks necromancy sounds cool or interesting. This story would lay the groundwork for modern depictions of necromancy within fantasy stories, though it would be quite a while before this style would catch on. The Hobbit would be published in 1937, almost exactly 5 years after Clark's story, and would make mention of a mysterious character known as the Necromancer. It would later be revealed that this character is the fallen Maya, Thu, better known as Sauron. It's not until 2002, in Morgoth's Ring, History of Middle-earth Volume 10, however, that we're told that he actually communed with the dead and made them his servants. A full 65 years between the introduction of the character and the explanation for his title. Obviously, Sauron didn't earn his fame through being a great or prolific necromancer, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention one of the most popular fantasy villains of all time. Most people don't associate Sauron with the living dead, but he does command a massive horde of evil creatures. He's also hell-bent on global domination. These traits, among other things, do lend him the air of your archetypical necromancer. In fact, he also shares a weakness very similar to many of the most powerful necromancers, but it'll be a while yet before that particular thing becomes a staple. Another famous necromancer would appear in the Chronicles of Prydain in 1964. Aron Deathlord is a powerful sorcerer with a lust for power. Anyone else starting to notice a pattern here? He made a bargain with the Witches of Morva for an artifact known as the Black Croken. This relic gave Aron the ability to reanimate the dead as mindless warriors. Aron is described as having a keen intelligence and is a cunning politician, having overthrown his mentor and ensured the deaths of those who conspired to overthrow him in turn. These 3 stories help to solidify the image of your typical necromancer. They're characterized, as many dark wizards are, with a strong desire for power. At this point, however, it's still very rare for these characters to be defined by the school of magic that they practice. They are more defined by their lust for domination and ability to subjugate others than by the strict limits of their magical ability. They would rarely engage their foes in direct combat, preferring instead to orchestrate attacks from afar and attempt to destroy their foes before they're even fully aware of an attack. However, there would be one more thing that necromancy would need in order to solidify its place and separate those truly dedicated practitioners from other dark or evil wizards who simply happen to utilize the undead. Indeed, the search for eternal life is one that many have engaged in, and even if they're not engaged in an active search for it, it's a common trope for wizards to live much longer than normal. The quest for immortality, however, is one that does not always end in the same place. H.P. Lovecraft's The Thing on the Doorstep features a body-swapping sorcerer who cheats death by stealing someone else's body, effectively damning the victim to die in their stead. Other examples of people seeking immortality include the Philosopher's Stone, both in real life and as depicted in Harry Potter, and the Witches of Stardust, who sought to eat the heart of a star in order to restore their youth and extend their lives. Of course, for the determined necromancer, there is a clear path, a dark, ominous path from which few ever return. I speak, of course, about lichdom.
Fall.
Broadly speaking, modern-day fiction depicts necromancers as any magic user that has the ability to manipulate the dead. This is not to be confused with demonologists who use magic to summon demonic spirits, nor should they be misconstrued as necrophiliacs who, well, let's just say that what gets their heart pumping is when yours stops.
By the way, do you happen to know what the fine is here in Cyrodiil for necrophilia? Just asking. Let's assume... no. That's nothing compared to Morrowind, thanks.
Manipulate is a fairly broad term that encompasses more than simply playing puppeteer with Grandma's bones. The definition of the word is to handle or control. So for example, any witch, wizard, or warlock that compels the dead to speak might be called a necromancer. By this definition, if you've ever used a Ouija board, you've at least attempted necromancy. It doesn't matter what type of magi you may be. Sorcerers, warlocks, wizards, witches, psionics, even clerics or paladins may be considered necromancers under this definition. Now, please understand that these other professions are necromancers by technicality alone. An artist, in the broadest sense, could be anybody who engages in any of the various creative arts. They may not conceptualize themselves as an artist. Much in the same way, a wizard or warlock may occasionally use necromancy, but do not necessarily consider themselves necromancers. After all, when you say necromancer, you don't really think of the level 13 cleric who's casting resurrection to undo the consequences of the rogue's actions. Which were absolutely justified, by the way. You're thinking of a particular kind of character. You're thinking of the amateur hour cultists who cast ice spells at you and have a single zombie under their control. You might be thinking of Kel'Thuzad from Warcraft or his partner Arthas, who would become the Lich King and field a massive undead army. Maybe, if you're really old school, you might have flashbacks to the Tomb of Horrors, doing battle against the Lich Acererak who was so powerful he outgrew the need for a body. Now these are necromancers. These are the kinds of characters that have largely defined necromancy and its image. You might have noticed as well that 2 of them are liches. Conveniently, they are our next topic. Understanding lichdom demands that I explain these concepts in greater detail. First, what exactly is a lich? Second, what is a phylactery? And finally, how did these 2 things, with wildly different origins, become so heavily dependent on each other in the context of fantasy? For the uninitiated, lichdom is the pinnacle of mortal necromantic achievement. The specifics vary from story to story, universe to universe, but in short, instead of raising a zombie to do your bidding, you're effectively raising yourself from the dead under your own control. It's a form of quasi-immortality that allows the user to live indefinitely so long as the phylactery, an item to which a lich's soul is bound, is protected. A more wide-reaching example would be if you've ever watched or read Harry Potter. Voldemort's Horcruxes are a variation of the phylactery. Moving on, lich is an archaic word synonymous with corpse. It's used similarly to words like cadaver or carcass. You may be familiar with its use in terms like Lichgate, which is the name for the covered entrance of a church's graveyard. The earliest use of the word lich that would refer to an undead wizard is found in Kothar the Barbarian, The Sword of the Sorcerer, by Gardner Fox, in which Fox describes the following scene. "Who are you?" Kothar growled.
My name was Afghor Khan. Long and long ago.
Kothar scowled. Afghor Khan? Surely he had heard Queen Elpha speak of Afghor Khan, who had been a mighty magician 50,000 years ago. He tried to think, but he could not, being held in thrall of the black, empty eye-holes of the dead thing standing before him, bent, brown, and old. If it could have smiled, the lich might have quirked its lips.
In the days when this land was known as Yarth, I was a sorcerer renowned from frozen Thum in the north to tropical Azanissa at the equator. My spells could level a city or raise up a tempest on the sea.
This undead wizard, while not explicitly any kind of necromancer himself, is clearly undead and incredibly ancient. Afghor Khan claims that at one time he was incredibly powerful, and if the Queen's stories of a powerful wizard named Afghor Khan are to be believed, then he's over 50,000 years old. Now, I speculate that the word lich was used in the archaic sense, describing this undead wizard as a corpse. This time, however, the term would stick with a certain influential individual that would take this character and adapt it for an expansion to his tabletop RPG. Indeed, Gardner Fox's friend, Gary Gygax, would add the Lich to the first supplement of Dungeons & Dragons, titled Greyhawk. The original description of the Lich was as follows. Liches. These skeletal monsters are of magical origin. Each Lich formerly being a very powerful magic user or magic user/cleric in life, and now alive only by means of great spells and will because of being in some way disturbed. Following this is a description of the Lich's abilities in-game. This is a very loose description and leaves a lot to the imagination in terms of how such a creature may have come to be. Perhaps it worshipped a death god in life. Perhaps a necromancer is behind rousing this absolute monster from the sleep of death. Or perhaps the creature had a pact with an otherworldly being. The perceptive will have noticed a conspicuous lack of a particular magical artifact. In 1976, a Lich was simply a powerful wizard who was undead by some means. Later that same year, Gygax would publish the third supplement to his game, titled Eldritch Magic. This would contain the first example of a named Lich in any form of media as far as I could find. It's a bit loose, but Brian Bloom wrote 2 artifacts for the supplement: the Eye of Vecna and the Hand of Vecna. Each was supposedly the remnants of an evil, destroyed Lich. How fitting, then, that Vecna should ascend to godhood. Well, okay, I say the first, but technically a Sararak existed in 1975 during the very first Origins game fair, but Tomb of Horrors wasn't actually published until 1978, so I think there's a little leeway there. Despite all this, how they came to be Liches and the means of their quasi-immortality had yet to become established. That would be remedied with the publication of Gygax's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual. The Lich would appear as a creature for a second time here, and would become a staple monster in the fantasy genre forever after. This appearance would be described as follows. A Lich exists because of its own desires and the use of powerful and arcane magic. The Lich passes from a state of humanity to a non-human, non-living existence through force of will. It retains this status by certain conjurations, enchantments, and a phylactery. So this establishes the most important part of being a Lich, in my opinion: existence of its own desire. This is what separates a magic-capable undead like a skeleton wizard and a true Lich. Conjuration and enchantments make sense, but what exactly is a phylactery, though? The description of the Lich doesn't elaborate further in this edition of the Monster Manual. In real life, phylacteries are leather boxes that have Torah verses and are worn by Jews when praying. The term has also been used to describe reliquaries. A quick Google search reveals the etymology of the term can be traced back to the Greek word meaning amulet. None of this, however, explains what a phylactery is supposed to be in the context of lichdom and necromancy. A phylactery, in this context, is what's known as a soul jar. The soul jar is a trope that describes people hiding their soul in a variety of objects or places in order to avoid death. The TV Tropes website, for example, lists the ancient Egyptian tale of 2 brothers. In this example, one of the brothers survives his death by hiding his heart in a tree. The example that I find the most interesting, however, is that of Koshchei the Immortal. Koshchei is, to quote Wikipedia, an archetypical male antagonist in Russian folklore. Tales of Koshchei tell of a spell he cast which stopped him from dying. He would hide his soul inside nested objects. The example listed at the top of the Wikipedia article is a needle hidden inside of an egg, inside of a duck, in a hare, in a chest, that is hidden on a remote island or buried somewhere. This trope was named for the 1986 video game Might and Magic. Necromancers in the game transfer their souls into literal jars in order to become liches. I believe this to have been heavily inspired by the June 1979 edition of Dragon magazine. This issue, numbered 26, contains an article by Len Lakofka titled Blueprint for a Lich, which describes the process by which one becomes a lich. Among other things, it lists the spells required for the ritual, among which are Magic Jar, Trap the Soul, and Enchant an Item. Let's have a little look at how these spells work, shall we? Whoa boy, that is a fucking mouthful. First edition Dungeons & Dragons did not fuck around with spell descriptions and rituals. In short, the spells do as they say on the tin, but require a lot of setup and materials to make them work. Trap the Soul has a little bit of a hidden cost in it, where you also need to learn the spells Maze and Enchant an Item in order to make use of it. Both Trap the Soul and Maze are 8th level spells. In case you're not familiar with just how powerful 8th level magic is, Wish, a 9th level spell, can allow you to do just about anything by making a wish, with the main caveat being, how is my dungeon master going to interpret this? Other 8th level spells include the ability to change the shape and size of any object, permanently give yourself a variety of abilities, force an enemy to dance, or render yourself immune to most magic. There's a reason that the 1st edition monster manual says Liches were formerly ultra-powerful magic users or magic users/clerics of not less than 18th level of magic use. In any case, these spells were used to prepare an item that the Lichdom candidate would place their soul within. The item prepared is what we've come to call the phylactery. It's at this point you might be asking, Ragnarok, if you're covering the history of necromancers, why are you going over an unofficial ritual for becoming a Lich in AD&D 1st edition? And the answer is, I won't. I'll put the document in the description of the video if you'd like to read the article for yourself, which I highly recommend. As far as I'm aware, it's the first recorded ritual for Lichdom. Ultimately, the takeaway from this should be that becoming a Lich is 2 things primarily. The first is extremely difficult. The spells you need to know, the materials you need to have, not to mention the in-universe discovery of such a ritual. These are all things that would be incredibly difficult for any prospective Lich to accomplish, particularly if they have to operate in secret. The second is intentional. Becoming a Lich does not happen by accident. These are the 2 things that I think define a Lich as a character and as a fantasy that people want to fulfill. This is what we keep in mind as we move forward. As of 1979, we have fully established the identity of the modern necromancer. So what's been done with this newly solidified identity? And the answer is a mixed bag. This version of the necromancer was far from common even throughout the 80s. The older, more historic versions of necromancers were more common, with few exceptions. In 1982, Necromancer, published by Synapse Software for the Atari 8-bit, came out. It's a fairly simple game where you play as a wizard and attempt to defeat Tetragorn the Necromancer. Though the game didn't have much in the way of variety, cycling through only 3 stages with varying levels of difficulty, it was well received enough to get subsequent releases for the Commodore 64 in 1983 and the Atari XEGS in 1987. Again though, this seems to be a more generic term for evil wizard than for a true necromancer. I mean, the minions aren't even undead. They're ogres. 1988's movie, The Necromancer, directed by Dusty Nelson, even features a necromancer that summons a demon to exact revenge on behalf of the main character. It wouldn't be until the 90s that we would begin to see this new fantasy identity become an archetype. Pre-2000s, finding depictions of necromancers that featured the Gygaxian archetype was a challenge. But fantasy was on the upswing in popularity, especially within video games. In 1993, Dungeon was released, a game where you and your party must find and kill the necromancer known as Malik Abdul Aziz. A year after this, Master of Magic, a turn-based game, would be the earliest example of a playable necromancer that I could find, where you can choose to command skeleton troops rather than regular soldiers. Elder Scrolls Arena would also release in that same year, paving the way for the more interesting 96 release called Daggerfall. Daggerfall, while lacking the ability to even summon a skeleton, did feature an entire faction of necromancers that the player can choose to side with as part of the main story. Doing this causes Mannimarco, the leader of the necromancer faction, to become a god. Though, actually it happens no matter what, and the warp in the West means that actually every single ending is Oh my god, someone stop me before I recount the entire history of Tamriel. Warcraft 1 and 2 in 94 and 95 were both very popular and helped establish the real-time strategy genre. The latter even features a warlock unit which can turn corpses into skeleton units, not to mention the Beyond the Dark Portal expansion for Warcraft 2, after which Ner'zhul would become the infamous Lich King. EverQuest, the MMO that was played by anybody that liked MMOs before World of Warcraft came out, featured a playable necromancer that had an undead pet. If it's not obvious from this point, most of the media featuring necromancers moved from literature to games. And video games, being a marriage of tabletop games and computers, are where one would expect to find more of those Gygax-inspired archetypes. Now, welcome to the year 2000, the modern era. First up, Diablo 2's Necromancer. To this day, it's generally agreed that the character captures the fantasy of being a powerful necromancer quite well. Being able to flood the screen with skeletons that proceed to demolish your foes on your behalf is quite a lot of fun. In my eyes, it's one of the greatest playable necromancers of all time. It sets the standard by which many other necromancers are judged, particularly in the genre of action RPGs. Shortly thereafter is Warcraft 3, which prominently features ActiBlizz's most famous necromancer, Kel'Thuzad. Kel'Thuzad was the final boss of Vanilla World of Warcraft and now also Classic World of Warcraft, and there was a quest where you could take his phylactery to a place called Light's Hope Chapel, with the quest text, "Who cares if Kel'Thuzad regenerates to full power?" The implication of completing this quest is that this incredibly powerful Lich, which took a party of 40 people to defeat in his original incarnation, is going to make a return. And he did, some years later in the expansion, Wrath of the Lich King. In recent years, there's been an explosion in the quantity of games that feature necromancy as something for players to engage with, either as a piece of world building or as an interesting mechanic to work into one's playstyle. There are too many properties to be able to go through all of them. Big names are obvious: The Elder Scrolls, Warcraft, Warhammer, Magic the Gathering. There are many smaller examples as well: Path of Exile, Tales of Maj'Eyal, Rift Wizard, Super Grave Snatchers. The list goes on. This hallowed, ancient practice has changed in both meaning and public perception many times throughout the ages. It's gone from being commonly viewed as controversial and censured to applauded and adored. Thanks to the ingenuity of story writers and game makers alike, necromancy's dark and occult aesthetic has been transformed into something larger than life. From divination to condemnation to reanimation, the origins of modern-day necromancers is a topic I believe is worth exploring, and I hope you've enjoyed joining me on this adventure through history. Little bit of tiny but potentially very important patchwork to be done here before the video ends properly. You may or may not have noticed that I forgot to mention voodoo in this entire video. Voodoo had a major influence on the depiction of zombies in particular. The most important thing to mention about it here, however, is that in the 30s, when Clark Ashton Smith wrote The Empire of the Necromancers, there was a bit of a voodoo craze going on that may or may not have inspired him to write the story. I didn't find anything confirming or denying this, but it felt very strange to write an entire video featuring the undead without at least mentioning voodoo. If you got to this point, I'd like to say thanks for watching. As I said, I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to offer my thanks to the following people: Nikitchie for helping me edit my script so that I didn't ramble quite as much, and Jack McKay for providing me with some resources for necromancy in historical context a few months back when I first started this project. If you'd like to see more from me, then liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell are all good indicators for me to not slack so hard on getting the next one out. If you'd like to see more regular stuff from me, I stream on Twitch every so often, and the schedule for it should be on that page. So yeah, I guess I'll see you all in the next one. Have a good one, folks.